developed countries are really starting to protect their resources in a way that hasn't been seen in the past. No one really wants to lend, no bank on our Bay Street is going to lend $1 million to an exploration company because they'll never see the $1 million again. And I think that's where a lot of companies that take on debt run into problems, is that they believe in a path to be able to repay coupon or repay the actual debt and aren't able to do that. So there's a lot of fear of sanctions and rule of law questions of operating in Ukraine and other jurisdictions in your sphere. I think that there's going to be a lot of sectors in Ukraine. I know the people to be very independent and resourceful. And I think that the resource base has been underdeveloped. And I think there's going to be a lot of reconstruction, and it should be a source of wealth for Ukrainians going forward. So I think other opportunities will arise.
All right, let's start. What's going on in mergers and acquisitions nowadays?
That's right.
What's cooking?
I think we're seeing a lot of activity. I think the biggest issue that we're dealing with in Canada is sort of a more robust posture from our government on state-owned enterprises, particularly with the shifts towards critical minerals and the need for critical minerals in the future economy. So developed countries are really starting to protect their resources in a way that hasn't been seen in the past, as they want to protect their domestic supply chains. So especially in Canada, we have a legislative scheme that allows us to review incoming transactions for national security reviews. And it was very rarely used in the past. We had only a few cases of it. But in more recent years, especially with the shift towards protecting critical minerals, we have this list of critical minerals. And whenever a company is involved in investing or buying assets that are on that list of critical minerals, we have a much more stringent review that could really throw a lot of uncertainty into into transactions. So you need to lay the groundwork, and you can't really control how the government is going to view your transaction or the outcome of it. So we're dealing with that quite a lot. Currently, the biggest producer of critical minerals is China, and then obviously you have a lot of conflict minerals coming out of Africa as well. But you have China making a lot of outbound investment that didn't really attract a lot of scrutiny. I'm a Canadian lawyer. Our firm practices all over the world, but working in Canada, we see that from the Canadian government now that we didn't used to see. So I think that in particular, where you have a lot of state-owned enterprises coming out of China making outbound investment is where we're seeing the biggest roadblocks, whether it's small investments, strategic investments in assets, or purchasing assets entirely. We see the government stepping in to even reverse some of those transactions where parties have negotiated a deal and taken expenses and gotten their shareholders on board, and we've had the government say, no, you guys can't do this. So
China is the very specific case, though. I feel like, how about like countries like Chile, Argentina, like some of the African countries? They also are very important in terms of the critical minerals, especially like copper, lithium, like things like that. I mean, China also bought a bunch of land
in those countries,
in all the countries, in the United States too,
So in terms of trends, I think that the Canadian experience is that it had some foreign investment in, but a lot of foreign investment out. I think that our experience is generally that countries in the developing world, if you want to use that term, are more used to having foreign investment inbound. So they have their own policy concerns about developing, but I think they're more interested in getting foreign investment regardless of who that investment is coming from, because they're more about who's going to offer the highest price and be able to offer the expertise to develop that asset in their country. So I haven't seen as much of that protection in the developing world. I see other issues that come up in those places as opposed to protecting a domestic supply chain. So I think in Argentina, you have a lot of Chinese investment. In Africa, all over the place, you have Chinese investment that are developing assets. So, but in Canada, we're kind of putting up a roadblock that we might not have seen, 5 years ago. So more recently, China is investing in Canadian assets in Canada and also in Canadian companies that have assets outside of Canada. And that's sort of been a really big change in how practitioners need to think about government protection of assets, because now we have a government that's really saying that assets that a Canadian company owns that are outside of Canada are effectively still subject to the jurisdiction under national security review
Yeah.
of Canada, saying we want to protect that asset, even if the asset might be in Argentina or in Chile or in an African country. So it's a posture that we haven't really experienced, even 5 years ago.
And what are, like, if we talk about like legal challenges, especially like when you deal with other countries, is there any common legal challenges that that always have to be overcome, and what are the strategies to do that?
I think the principal legal concern is mineral tenure. So how you own the land, and whether your client, whether whoever your client is, whether they're going to be safe in owning the land and being able to conduct the activities that they want to on that land. So, practicing as a lawyer in Canada, I can only advise on Canadian aspects of law, but we engage with lawyers all over the world on issues that come up with our clients' work in those jurisdictions. And so we as lawyers will rely on experts in those jurisdictions, whether lawyers or government relations people, and our clients will sort of do the best they can to create relations on the ground, whether that's in-house, in-country staff, in-country government relations, laying the groundwork in terms of social work immediately. But I think that's the principal concern is how are they going to hold the rights to that land, and will it be protected, and will they be able to do what they need to on it in the future? Do they hold the proper rights to be able to invest in it and develop it?
Why do like all of this development permits take so long to process? And is there any potential solution, especially when you deal like with developed countries? Is there any strategies to overcome it, like expedite this process? Why is it such a grueling process? I guess.
I think that there's various answers to that on a country by country basis. Yeah. So each country, even regions within countries, have their own reasons why there would be opposition or difficulty navigating a permit. I think, and this is my own personal commentary, not Fasken commentary, but I think that people in Canada, we have a wide bureaucracy, and it takes a long time to do anything within that bureaucracy, and people aren't always willing to put forward a decision because they don't want to be responsible for that decision. And there's been, in the industries that we work for, principally mining, there have been as many benefits as mining bring to countries. There are also a lot of high profile incidents that, scare people. And so if you're a government official and you permit a mine and something happened with the mine, then all of a sudden you look like you're responsible for it. I don't feel like there's people that want to take responsibility for that, and they just kind of push it into the next government. And so there's just constantly something else that they're finding to see. I think that's sort of the experience in Canada, is that there's always something else to check. We also have a duty to consult with Indigenous peoples in our Constitution. There's not a lot of clarity as to what that means and what rights that gives to Indigenous groups. And some Indigenous groups might feel that it gives them a right to block a project. And so if a government is fulfilling its duty to consult and is facing opposition, maybe feels that it can't greenlight something because it doesn't have the right groups on board. So I think there's a constant tension between people who want to develop an asset and the government who needs to permit it, with these Indigenous groups who have a massive stake in these development projects. On a country by country basis, we see other issues in other countries. Like in South America, for example, you have people who don't want to, a lot of Indigenous groups living on lands, you don't feel that mining projects might damage the environment there, or maybe that they don't have the necessary resources to fulfill the needs of a mining project. And an easy example is water permits in Chile. Chile is a very dry country where you need to take a lot of water into these projects, and you're taking potentially water away from communities that might need it, or trucking water up mountains in certain environments. So it's quite difficult to get people on board and to buy into what you need to develop these assets. And I'm not sure there's an easy answer. I'm not sure there's an easy way to
Yeah.
say, oh, if we fix this, our permitting times would be. I think that we need a lot of commitment from our governments to see that there's a lot of benefit to development, and a willingness to make a decision.
What do you think about just the current ESG requirements? And obviously, Canada is like one of the leaders pushing those regulations up front. Do you think it's a subject for more bureaucracy, or it's actual it actually legitimately helps, to comply and to improve the environment and to mitigate the impact of mining operations?
I think that there are genuine benefits to a less carbon intensive operation. So things like electric vehicles on a mining operation are generally better than diesel burning, fuel burning vehicles. I think that has a lot of benefits for the environment. I do believe in that, but I think that there's sometimes the costs of those kinds of changes haven't caught up to make it a realistic option for some operators. And so they're always going to have that cost benefit analysis. And if it feels like they're being regulated into a more expensive option, then they'll feel like they're being regulated against their interests. So I think as costs come down for things like electric vehicles, more reliance on solar energy for projects, easier ways of generating power and cleaner power for projects, I think that people feel the impact less like they're being regulated against their interests. But I think in general, the trend towards less carbon intensive operations is good.
If we talk about especially like how many exploration companies don't make it to until their operation point, do you think this regulation is partially responsible for that? Because like to buy the equipment, it's like millions of dollars, and it's kind of like a lot of, like, I understand that there is long-term benefits, but in terms of the short term, it's a very expensive process to even be complied with all of those regulations. Do you think it kind of like drives these small companies out of the business? Or
in my experience, my view is that it wouldn't have a significant impact. Like, if I think you're talking about sort of greenfields exploration companies, and I think that the biggest driver of that is exploration success. So if you have a project of merit, you've raised some capital, you're probably renting equipment. It's probably not that carbon intensive in terms of usage of fuel or exhaust. You're drilling a few holes in the ground. You might have some remediation in terms of the damage you've done to the environment, but I don't think that's overall indicative of the success or failure of a project. It's really about what you find in the ground. And then when, let's say, you have a project that's worth developing, when it comes time to make those capital allocation decisions as to whether you'll have a solar power grid or diesel generators to power the project, then you'll be faced with the decision that, does it make sense cost-wise to build cleaner power or not?
How frequently, like, things like economics, infrastructure, risk analyzing like mining asset acquisitions?
I think it's a massive concern throughout our clients' evaluation of any project. But where we might not be involved in sort of making a value judgment on the economics of a particular region, we would be involved in reading the disclosure about that and making sure the disclosure adequately reflects any risks and considerations to a shareholder or potential investor. That's sort of my role. And one thing that comes to mind is, for example, emerging markets disclosure. So we have a regime in Canada where if you are operating in an emerging market, and that term is extremely broad and only a few jurisdictions are not emerging markets, you have a whole set of disclosures that you have to make to investors and shareholders about operating in that jurisdiction. So that's the kind of thing we would be involved in. Not necessarily advising our clients as to what jurisdiction to operate in as a legal advisor. If we were wearing a different hat, a director, that sort of thing might.
Do you have a say, or like at least do you advise your clients in terms of like what kind of technology they use for their operations? Even when it comes to even like early exploration, let's say when they just do drilling like exploration to do like mineral resource estimation, or even like before they buy a deposit. Do you deal with this type of things that, okay, I think, that would be the most efficient way to proceed? Because there are a lot of technology now that is more efficient and maybe more complementary to early exploration to understand where deposits are, and they kind of like reduce this price of super expensive drilling process.
It's an interesting question. So we hold ourselves out only as legal advisors. So
Yeah.
we are not really qualified to tell a geologist what equipment they might want to use to determine the geology of a particular deposit. And we're not, insured to give that kind of advice. Now, that said, there's a lots of, we have many roles, and we also have a lot of experience with junior companies. So if a company had a lot of success and just raved about a service provider or a technological innovation, we wouldn't hesitate to suggest to another client, say, hey, our client here had a lot of success with this. Look at their use case here. And these people were great to work with. So why don't you think about using this? Another way that people might get involved is it's not unheard of for lawyers to be directors of companies as well. And at that point, your role changes. You stop being necessarily a legal advisor and you become responsible for the direction of the company. And at that point, you can use your own experience to shape the decisions of the company. But that's different than acting as a legal advisor. So, as a transactional lawyer, our operational decision making is fairly limited, and every lawyer is different and depends on their own relationship with each client. But as a transactional lawyer, you're often engaged very heavily in transactions and ongoing regulatory work, but not necessarily in operational decision making.
Mm-hmm.
That's been my experience. And there might be other lawyers who have different experiences.
Do you have how many clients? I mean, obviously, Faskin is a huge company, right? And I know from earlier conversations with you that you have to deal with a lot of corporations. But do you have like clients that invested in like mining assets without a clear understanding of what's going on, without a clear understanding of what the end product? Do you advise them like
I don't want to say anything against each of my clients, but I think that I'll speak in some general terms. I think that commodity markets have a massive influence on exploration activity and capital raising activity. And there is an ecosystem that takes advantage of that in various cycles. And so you do get a lot of actors who want to be participants in a particular commodity cycle or price cycle or story or regional play, and might not be thinking about or might not have the experience to actually develop the asset, or might have experience in another commodity and then be switching to another commodity entirely and become experts at it. That is extremely common in our industry. Now, we are a for-profit business where we offer our services to clients for remuneration. So we wouldn't say necessarily that we could give advice to clients and say maybe this isn't the best way to allocate your capital, but it's not really up to us to allocate the capital. If shareholders have put in cash and the directors are willing to drill holes in this region, we're not going to say you shouldn't do what your directors are directing you to do. It would be kind of against our economic interests as well, to be crass, but we do try and steer our clients away from things that might not be the best way. But to answer your question very directly, yes, it does happen. And you do see a lot of players that want to be part of stories that might not be experts in that field or have a history in that field or commodity or region.
What kind of factors, like economic or maybe some other, like, again, infrastructure, location, like permits or anything like that, what factor faces the most scrutiny?
Well, I think I'm going to answer the question from the perspective of my client, if you'll let me. And I think that, and I'm responding to this on experience that I've had recently. And I think that our clients are looking for assets in what they would call safe jurisdictions where you know that your rights will be protected. Now, there are downsides to operating in Canada, for example. We just talked about them, a long permitting time, but at the same time, you generally don't have a risk that your asset will be taken away from you or that your personnel might be in jeopardy for operating the asset. So I think that's a principal concern when evaluating jurisdiction. Like we see a lot of our clients and other mining participants moving to Western Hemisphere countries, Canada, the United States, looking at options in those jurisdictions. And I think the second biggest factor is management more than jurisdictional. A lot of like I'm a transactional lawyer, so when a company wants to raise money, it's going to go out and seek cash from people to invest in, let's say, a West African project. It needs to give disclosure to those shareholders about that West African project so that they have appropriate information to make an investment decision. And if our laws say that you have to give this information to them, or else those shareholders or investors can sue the company. So that's the kind of role that I have in terms of protecting our company to make sure that they gave appropriate disclosure to investors. Now, in terms of on the ground experience, like we don't really often have expertise in those jurisdictions. We would rely on local counsel and local personnel. So companies, the best case scenario is they have experience in those jurisdictions and have contacts in those jurisdictions that they can rely on to make those assessments. Because once it sort of crosses the border into different jurisdictions, Fasken has no real role in protecting the asset.
Do you give them like any type of key things to look out for in this case? I guess, do you give them any strategies to?
I think we would have some strategies that would satisfy the Canadian market, financing market, to be able to finance a project. So these projects,
what are the considerations? I guess what are the strategies?
I think the principal one would be obtaining a title opinion and being able to evidence the rights you have to your project, because someone is going to be doing due diligence on you as a project owner to be certain that they can put money into this project. And some things work for that evidence and other things don't. You can't just say, I talked to the minister and he said I could go into the desert and drill holes, right? You have to have some sort of evidence from the government. And, our experience is often useful in those situations, because if someone's operating in, name a country, we'll have someone who's done deals in that country. We'll call them up and say, what did you deal with? What are the things to look out for?
Do you have any crazy stories to share?
I think it's, I can think of a couple. One, a company was already operating, and it's not a new story, but, it was entering into a partnership with another company. And it's a common story where the state government came in and assessed, as a result of that transaction, a significant tax bill that was sort of out of the blue and not really related to anything in their written legislation. Right. So we had to have some emergency discussions with the government representatives and in-country people of that client on the ground to sort of make that tax bill go away. And then some recent experiences. I'm not certain that this is what you're asking about, but I was like, I'm thinking of recent experiences with M&A. We had an asset outside of Canada owned by our client that was organized in Canada, and they wanted to sell to a state-owned enterprise from China. And we had some shareholders express opposition to that because they thought that our clients weren't giving the shareholders value. And then we had to deal with the notification regime of the government as well. So we had a complex mix of people looking at this transaction and trying to explain to them why it was a good deal, with various constituencies to satisfy. And it was sort of on the cutting edge of this new posture in the critical mineral space. And it's a well-publicized deal. I don't think I need to name it, but it was an interesting...
What was the result? Did you convince them?
Yeah, it was approved by shareholders, which is the key metric by which we determine whether the deal should go ahead or not. So shareholders had a say in this, and the shareholders voted for the deal. So I think that was the key approval we got. At the time, the national security review was deemed not necessary. So we gave the necessary notifications under the law. We were proactive about it, and we were thinking about what might happen. So we gave the necessary notifications, and it was ultimately deemed not to be worthy of a national security review. Now, because of the reaction in the media to that, since that deal, there's probably been more aggressive use of the national security review function, possibly as a response to the media response to that deal. So.
And in terms of like price volatility from the experience perspective, how do you mitigate those risks?
So commodities will fluctuate in price all the time, and we go through various cycles where any commodity is the hottest in the market at any moment. Ultimately, mining projects are going to be judged on whether they make money or not.
Yeah.
Because if you actually develop an asset, is the price you can sell your material for more than what it costs for you to make it. So if you are trying to raise capital and you are using very aggressive assumptions to try and finance a project, that's where we can advise. And I think that it's incumbent upon qualified persons as well to advise, to make sure you're using reasonable prices for your commodity price assumptions in your future. So like that, it gets interrogated all the time. So we have a lot of experience. Companies want to make their project look as good as possible, and we want to make sure that they're able to not get in trouble with the regulator, and that shareholders don't come around and say something you sold us a bill of goods in the future that wasn't true. So we know through our dealings with the regulators where they're going to press on commodity price assumptions, looking at market metrics and future commentary. But at the same time, that's also a very important qualified person's role. And a lot of times qualified persons will outsource that, like if they're at an actual economic study stage, to some sort of other expert on pricing, because a geologist might not be the best person to assess the price of cobalt in 5 years. Now, when it's a operator, the key is just making your costs as low as possible in a low commodity price environment. So, if they have a couple of options in that case, if the price was high at the time they made their investment decisions, and then at the operating time, the price is low, they have to lower costs, whether it's putting their mind on care and maintenance. And then that can have a series of effects on their debt, all sorts of effects that way. But that's an operational decision to lower your costs. And I think that's the principal concern.
Speaking of financing, again, and like talking about why a lot of exploration companies don't make it to the moment of when they actually start producing something. What is the role of like debt, like equity and debt financing in mining operations? Like, I guess, how do companies decide between the two?
So it's an interesting question. At early stages, debt implies repayment, and equity doesn't. Equity implies ownership. So when you're at an early stage exploration company, you have zero revenue and you have zero projections of revenue for maybe 10 or 15 years. So a debt instrument isn't usually a realistic option for most junior companies, because they have no repayment profile. So no one really wants to lend, no bank on our Bay Street is going to lend $1 million to an exploration company, because they'll never see the $1 million again. The $1 million goes into the ground, gets capitalized on the balance sheet, and then says someone else can invest in it because we're now $1 million more valuable in theory. That's why equity investors all invest in the early stages, because these companies can't really attract debt financing. At a certain point in the future, these companies are going to make a business decision whether the value of dilution through equity is valuable enough to grow that they need to attract that, if they have a path to repaying debt, or they can say, we're going to take a little bit of debt, pay 5%, but we're going to grow at 10%. So it's worthwhile for us to pay debt and not dilute the rest of the shareholders, but they need to be able to repay that debt. And I think that's where a lot of companies that take on debt run into problems, is that they believe in a path to be able to repay coupon or repay the actual debt and aren't able to do that. So, when we get the chance, we tend to advise early stage companies not to take it unless they have an ability to repay that debt.
So you would advise more for equity?
I don't think that there's a realistic option for junior companies in the early stages other than that. But there's a number of considerations that go into that. Like I think the principal one is whether the company can handle the repayment or not. Right. Even some of the senior companies might already be in debt, and so they can't take on more debt. So they're going to issue equity to handle their existing debt, right? So that's even though they're able to service some debt, they can't service more debt, right? So It really depends on the company's growth stage, where they are in the growth cycle and life cycle.
Do you think most exploration companies don't make it just because they have problems in financing, or there is some other factors that play a role?
I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but I think there's a lot of factors that could influence it. Principally, if a project is really good, typically it will get financed because people will be able to recognize if that piece of land and those rocks are worthwhile continuing. Mm-hmm. But a principal factor outside of that is also management. Can management execute on their plan? Maybe they have a really good piece of land, but aren't able to do the necessary things to move it forward. Maybe they're just not in it for the right reasons, or maybe they don't have the skills or the knowledge to drill in the right places. And so management has an outsized effect on that. A lot of times you have great land and great rocks, but maybe the external factors around it will mean that it never gets developed. Maybe you're in a position where you're on an environmentally sensitive piece of land, right? So maybe you have the rights to that and say, oh, you should finance us because we have this great geology, but the reality is you're never going to be able to mine there. So there's a lot of factors why exploration companies don't get off the ground. Now, it's necessary to throw a lot of darts to try and find something valuable. So, the success rate is low.
I guess the last segment that I want to talk about, obviously your, child of Ukrainian immigrants, right? You, based on what I read, yeah.
My grandparents immigrated, so parents are here.
Okay, grandchild of Ukrainian immigrants. So I know that you're part of a Ukrainian organization. You're kind of active member of the Ukrainian community. Do you have any clients or any projects or collaboration that you're part of that kind of support Ukrainian mining sector, especially now? And what do you think will happen with the mining sector in Ukraine once the war is over?
So we have had some interest. There's a company in Canada that is listed on TSX that has a project in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And it's been around for a while. And I think it might be an indicator of where things go because it's a known deposit. So we know of some potential interest in Ukrainian deposits. But I think what has held Ukraine back as a center of resource development is rule of law questions and just the ability to be certain that your rights will be respected in that jurisdiction going forward. Yeah. Now, no one really knows what's going to happen after the war and what the law is going to be and what the country is going to look like. But I think that once, I envision a future for Ukraine. And I think that once we have one company or one story of success and that can show how it can be done, I think other people will follow. Until we have that sort of success, like we have this asset that's been in Ukraine but hasn't really been able to get traction. I think once we have that sort of traction, other people will be willing to follow. And I think that Ukrainians will be very motivated to have a country that is going to move forward and be economically secure and, join a global community that as a profitable place. So, and want to be in that same sort of community.
So you think there will be kind of like a caution in the beginning, but once one project kickstarts, people.
I think so. I think there needs to be someone willing to take some risk and show some success, and others will follow. Because until that, there's a lot of fear of sanctions and rule of law questions of operating in Ukraine and other jurisdictions in your sphere. But I know that Ukraine doesn't have the best reputation prior to 2021. What's going to happen after 2024 and 2025? We don't know. But I have a lot of hope in the ability of Ukraine to grow and come out of this a resilient and strong economic force.
Do you think mining would be part of this the whole rebuilding process, or you think there will be other opportunities that would arise during this rebuilding phase?
I think other opportunities will arise. I think that Ukraine has a lot of expertise that it's developed that other countries that depend on foreign investment don't quite have as developed a sector as. And I'm thinking, for example, tech services. There's a very native and very skilled tech services industry in Canada, in Ukraine. But there's also a resource base that hasn't been as well developed. Whereas other countries where you think about foreign investment models, a lot of the time it's investing in developing an asset with foreign funds. I think that there's going to be a lot of sectors in Ukraine. I know the people to be very independent and resourceful. And I think that the resource base has been underdeveloped, and I think there's going to be a lot of reconstruction, and it should be a source of wealth for Ukrainians going forward. So hopefully some of those resources are used in rebuilding Ukraine and making it a profitable and safe place in the future.
All right. I think that's an excellent point to finish our discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time. I'm looking forward to do it again sometime.
Thank you, Anya. I just want to say thank you to you for following up and for K-Mine for giving the opportunity for me to have this conversation. So,
thank you. All right.